Excuse me. So if you want to follow along, if you want to, if you already painted this and you feel like it's really done, if you want to like focus in on the portrait or something, you could do that, just like a little study as I paint, if you just want to paint along, or if you just want to watch, or if you want to work on a different portrait of a similar setup. My plan today is similar to what we talked about earlier with a few of the paintings we saw. We have like a good foundation here, and I just want to like, I want to turn the lights on. I want to look at that line of the core shadow, splitting it off with warm and cool like we did last week, and just push that contrast a bit. There's plenty of work to do here in the portrait, and then those same relationships are echoed on this arm right here. Less so on this one, because this isn't getting that cool reflected light from this side. But we see it in this hand too. I think starting with the portrait is a good place to get going, though, to really, that's where that relationship is really most clear, I think. I'm going to zoom in on that. And we haven't done a lot of this semester, but I'm going to use my tiny paintbrush. I'm going to move pretty slowly and methodically. And like we were saying earlier, let's see if my predictions hold up. I'm going to use, starting with these like warm tones in the face over here, I'm going to use burnt sienna and yellow ochre. And it's like a, let me zoom out real quick. You can see my palette. It's like a really saturated, warm midtone. And I want to think about that line of the core shadow, how it like kind of divides the face into the light shape and the shadow shape. We could call that the Terminator edge. I call it the line of the core shadow. But it's like being, if this head right here was planet Earth and we were standing right here in the line of the core shadow, we would be experiencing a sunset. That light source is kind of just going beyond the horizon, and what we're drawing is that horizon line itself.
And they, is that usually the darkest part of the shadow?
Yeah, you're right. Not always, because sometimes there is, let me share my screen real quick. Sometimes there's like a shadow within the shadow, like let's say inside the nostril, or sometimes where two forms meet, like the eyelid meeting the eye socket right there. That's one step darker just because there's just no light getting in there. But if we just think about the head as like a whole system of like light logic, on this transition alone, going from let's say the highlight to the greater light shape to like where the form shadow begins. Here's the line of the core shadow, and then it lightens up into reflected light. You're right in thinking that that core shadow line is the darkest part of that shadow. So when we draw or paint that sphere, like a simple sphere with the highlight and all those pieces of the shadow I just mentioned, that line of the core shadow is generally the darkest. The absolute darkest dark is like if we think of that sphere again, it's where the sphere is meeting the ground plane that it sits on, which is that again, that's like the where two forms are meeting. Hopefully this glare isn't too much here. So I don't want this edge to be too sharp. So I'm going to take some water and soften that a little bit. Remember, a lot of this is just, I'm just like chasing my edges around with a clean brush and water to soften things. And here on the forehead, it's not like a clear boundary. It's a little bit more spread out. It's more of a gradation. On the nose, on that front plane of the nose, it's a little bit closer to a line, but uh like I've said earlier, I think of more of it like a firm edge than a sharp one. A sharp edge is pretty abrupt. This is that like more saturated mid-tone, kind of just before the shadow that I'm just spreading around here, like kind of following around the outside edge of that nose, or of the nostril, I should say, on this like front facing plane of the cheek. And then here on the tip of the nose, I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit softer. So like coming down from the bridge of the nose, that's more of like a plane change. It's a little bit more of like a, think of it like a rectangular shape. Here on the tip of the nose, it's a little bit more spherical and round. Another thing I recommend doing, and maybe I already said this last week, but if you want to get more into portraiture, something that helps me a lot, it was an assignment that I had to do when I was a student, and now I give the same assignment to my life drawing students if we're learning about portraits, is to print out some heads and faces or flip through some magazines that have big printed heads and faces. Take a Sharpie marker or any kind of a pen or something. Sharpie markers are good because they're really, really clear. And draw that head construction stuff right on top of the face. So instead of looking at a head and copying it onto a different piece of paper and trying to get all those forms to be accurate, copying it right on the surface there will really help you. It's like you're training the way that you're seeing the head as much as the way that you're drawing it. And if you can find all those different planes and simple shapes when you look at someone's head, it's going to be way easier to break it down simply and not get caught up in the weeds chasing details. That part of the cheek is really saturated. I'm going to grab a little bit of cad yellow and cad red, which I mentioned earlier is like a slightly more vibrant orange than burnt sienna right here on this cheekbone. I'm going to push the color there a little bit more.
This is a dumb question, Shane, but do you consider like burnt sienna and some of those browns? Where would you put them on the color wheel? Would you put them with orange?
Yes,
Okay.
brown is like dark orange. It's not a dumb question. I remember I was in like art school and I was thinking like, is brown just dark orange? But it is.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Because orange is the opposite of blue. And to make a good saturated dark gray, sorry, not saturated, a good like neutral dark desaturated gray, we mix brown and blue together to make it's like almost black. It's because they're complements, they're the opposites of each other, and brown is just the opposite of blue, which means it's orange. So much of like how we think about color is based on the 8 Crayola crayons that come in the box and the names on them. My 2-year-old's always arguing with me. I'll talk about the red crayon and he says no, it's pink. And I'm like, pink is red. Why don't you know that? I'm gonna grab a larger brush and basically do the same thing on the rest of the figure now. So I'm just pushing those midtones a little bit darker, right up against that edge of the shadow. Oh, sorry, let me zoom out on here. Actually, get a bigger brush. So yeah, I did everything. I loaded the whole brush up and I was ready to go, right about to put it on the paper, and I decided it's not quite the right brush for that single mark right there. So I'm going to use this one. I had a teacher tell me once, like, using a brush that's too small, it's like painting a house. You're just filling in color.
When you're using the term mid-tone here, are you just talking about like what's between the shadow colors and more or less the brighter highlight colors?
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
a general?
Because that's really where the color is. That's where the color's most saturated, is between the light and the dark. Let me try and find an example. I'm looking around. Let's say we could look at this blue paper towel. Not a great example. Yeah, it's not a very good example, actually. Basically, if you think about like let's say if you're looking at a lemon, I have a lemon inside. Let me grab it. So if we look at this lemon, the brightest part is this highlight, and it's it's really light. This shadow's over here, it's darker. The most saturated color, let me bring these down. This is, you can really see it here. The most saturated color is here in the midtone, like in the middle. Does that make sense? The the
Yes.
highlight is really
Yeah.
light. It's not as saturated.
Yeah.
The shadow is not as saturated. The brightest yellow is kind of just after the highlight as it's turning towards the shadow here. So really kind of in this zone right here. That's also where you see the texture. Those little dimples in the skin, you don't see them as much in the highlight. You don't see them as much in the shadow. You see them here in the midtone. So that's why I'm always going on about that line of the core shadow, like right around here. From here to here, that's probably the most important information on making it look like whatever the thing is, whether it's a lemon or a face. So like even the texture of the skin, whether it's a lemon or a face, is happening all right here within that
Yeah,
collision.
that's a great example. That's good.
Yeah, because like sometimes we think mostly about the highlights because we're like, oh, if we want to make it shiny, if we put the highlight on, that's going to make it look real. Or we'll push the shadows extra dark and that'll increase the contrast and we'll think that will make it look real. But really, the hardest and most important work is in between. It's the shades of gray. I pull this out again. It's it's not so much over here, not so much over here. The most important information is in here, and that's the hardest to see sometimes too. So that's all these relationships happening between those two. We gotta paint more lemons next. I think we painted a lemon this semester, but maybe we'll do. I think it was part of a bigger still life. So if we do a single lemon painting, that might make that extra clear. A good way to remember that, or a way that I always think of, and I don't know if there's a reason for this that's related. It might be just a coincidence, but looking at a sunset, like at the beach or something, when you're in that transition on the earth, that's when the sky turns all those crazy colors. So I always think like if you want more color, look for where the light is meeting the shadow. You can see that on his left bicep here, going from light to dark. Maybe that might be a local color thing. Maybe this color of his skin is more saturated there for some reason that, but no, I think it's because of the light and shadow. You can see it right here too. Going from here to here, this gets like really, really warm. And that's why up here too on the cheek we see that really clearly on that front plane of the nose and on the front of the forehead. It's funny seeing my painting here on my screen there on the Zoom window right next to the photo reference. And I feel for everyone when we put our work up on the discussion board and then I put it right next to the photo reference and it every little mistake just jumps out. And I see that now just looking at my painting. I'm like, wow, I have plenty of work to do here. A little bit of that color up here on top of the deltoid too. There's this plane change. A little bit on the bottom of the forearm. So I'm just picking out, I'm trying to it's kind of how we started the painting last week. I'm just dialing in um, that color and the light shape. I know I started out looking at the line of the core shadow, but I'm actually kind of building up to that with this color first. Okay, now I'm going to look at the cooler side and start to think about how these two are colliding. I'm trying to remember what we used on the cooler side. I want to say alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. And maybe if this gets too violet, we can desaturate it with a little bit of yellow ochre. Something like that. I don't want to overdo it on this side because of that reflected light. So I'm going to add plenty of water to this. Almost looks like there's a little bit of like a green blue in there. I'm going to add some more yellow and some more blue. I'm going to use that smaller or this medium-sized brush from earlier. I'm starting here on the arm because it's a little bit simpler. This light to dark, warm to cool transition. It's the same relationships on the face, but just in a way more complicated pattern. So I want to get it right on here first, or get it wrong on here first so it's easier to fix. Here on the hand, you can see the cool and the warm mixing back and forth depending on because there's so many little plane changes on those tendons behind the knuckles there. You can see little bits of warm coming through. There's a little bit of a warm shape right here. And then right here on that where the ulna sticks out right here, you're getting a little bit more of that warmth right there. So with the light and dark and the warm and cool, and then the different edges is going to be a balance of how much water we're using with our pigment and how dry it might be. So I'm going to push this brown right there. You can even see it on the fingers, how different it is based on that reflected light coming from the right side. This shadow here is warmer because this cooler, whatever this cooler light source is over here, the reflected light, isn't really seeing this, the middle finger, the one to the left of the one with the ring. And then this one over here, the pinky, is catching some of that cooler reflected light. Even though it's still in the shadow based on the main, more intense light source, that's why this one is cooler. One thing I forgot about here is this edge is too sharp. I gotta, hopefully it's not too dry. Try and reactivate this and just drag it over to the edge of the arm there, which is kind of losing a lot of the pigment, so I might have to repaint pieces of this. And now it's like blooming a little too much. But I feel like in general that went kind of okay. So I feel safe about going back into the portrait with those same colors now. So similar to what I did with the arm here, I'm going to do that on the face now. That line of the core shadow. Hopefully this is still a little bit damp and I don't get too sharp of an edge, but it's not too wet that I just totally lose control too. But this line of the core shadow coming down is the darkest part of this transition. Also looks like my initial spot for the ear on this side is a little bit off, so I can fix that later with repainting the background. Sorry for this glare. I don't know if that's any better.
Shane, just then, were you using the end of the hard part of your brush with a paper towel to wipe away in a more fine-tuned manner?
Absolutely. That's it.
That's a great trick.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry if I didn't even mention that. I feel like uh, yeah, I do that all the time.
Another trick you can do is to take the butt end of the brush and make veins like on plant leaves.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
if the color's wet, it works really good and it just darkens the lines up without having to try to paint them in.
Yeah.
Just to kind of
You
press a little
can
bit.
you can like drag pigment around with it too. I'm just taking a clean brush and smoothing some of these out, kind of while it's drying, before it's fully dry. Try and soften that transition even more still. Because then I can just go back and do that all over again, sharpening things up a little bit darker. So this is like a little bit of magenta with some of the ultramarine blue, so it's like a desaturated violet for that side plane of the chin there. I'm gonna drag the same bit over here for the cheekbone. Might be too dark, so I'm gonna clean my brush off even more and then try and drag the same pigment through. Which one? All right, there's a lot going on in this face here, so I'm gonna let this dry before I mess it up any further. And I have to cut in and kind of like redraw that whole side of the face there too. That's what that little gap is right there. I'm not going to do it now because I want to make sure it's dry, but I know I got to go back for that. I think what I could do in the meantime is get into the fabric. So I'm going to clean off my palette. And we can think about what's going on here across the chest. So I've got a bunch of alizarin crimson, and I'm going to grab some yellow ochre. The yellow ochre is going to be way less powerful compared to the crimson, so just think about how much of each you need to balance that out. And I mentioned earlier, there's this like glow here in the center. Gets a little bit more yellow on this side. As it gets darker in that direction, it gets a little bit more red going in this direction. Kind of doing a mix of like softer and sharper brush strokes here. Before I go in with like those really dark ones though, I'm just gonna build up some of that color, kind of like what we started with the figure. But I want to keep in mind that overall light to dark that we talked about earlier. So all this down here, we'll push that way darker before we're done. Looking at these saturated areas over here. I'm using the texture of the paper at the side of the brush. I'm being pretty fluid about how I approach this too. With how like careful we were in the face. I'm opening this up a little bit here. As long as the light makes sense and the values and the edges, got a little bit more freedom here in the fabric. Even though I'll probably cover this up later, I'm just putting this down over here just so I don't have little random light shapes shining through later on. Up here, it's okay. I'm going to leave some of those brighter areas because there is a lot of light up in there. Here's the top of that necklace. I know it's purple, but there is some red in there. I do want to let this all dry for a minute, but before I do that, I just want to fix that edge of the face over there with a really dark shadow. I'm going to do burnt sienna and ultramarine blue with lots of pigment here. Maybe a little bit of alizarin crimson. Just to reshape this side of the head. You can see near the brow too, it got a little bit too wide. Uh-oh. Should have waited for that to dry. Thought it was dry. Let's see down here how close I can get. You can kind of see it from like the edge of the mustache or beard to the bottom of the ear. I think I have too much space. Just as a little note for myself, I'm just using this same color to map out these planes before I walk away. Okay, I gotta let this dry before I ruin it. I'd like to take a quick break. It's almost 11. I'm gonna try and come back in 5 minutes. And hopefully this will be more dry. And we can continue on. All right, I'm gonna let this sit for just a few minutes. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I forgot to hit record, or I forgot to hit stop record when I walk away sometimes. So sometimes there's like 5 or 10 minutes of just empty space in the middle of our demo video. All right. So a couple more things I want to do before I go back and like revisit what I just opened up there. I think this arm needs a little bit more of that form shadow turning towards the background there. And that shadow is pretty dark, but pretty warm. It's not getting that other reflected light, so I'm going to use burnt sienna, alizarin crimson. If you have burnt umber, that would work too. Do a tiny bit of ultramarine blue to darken it a little bit further. And up here, just like we were mentioning earlier, I'm going to try and warm it up right before it turns towards the light right there. So I used a little bit of cad red and cad yellow. And now I got to soften the whole thing with some water. All these edges are pretty soft. Similar shadows happening over here too. So not the fabric itself, but the shadow from the fabric onto the arm right here is what I'm looking at. It's pretty dark and pretty warm. Alrighty, one thing I can do here before I go back into the face there is I'm gonna knock in this purple color for the necklace he's got on. So I do think that's a big part of the composition. It's such a striking shape and color right there. So this is lots of that magenta and ultramarine blue and some alizarin crimson. I'm using this flat brush because I want to see if I can get this all in one shot here. Maybe that color can come in handy if I go back in and rework some of the portrait now where I left off earlier. I'm still going to start off with that same burnt sienna. Maybe I'll just use burnt sienna with a little bit of this violet from the necklace below and mix those together. Because I still want to go in and deal with this eye over here that I've kind of neglected. So I don't want to underestimate the distance from this inside corner of the eye right here to the side of the nose, to the front of the nose, all the way over to the next eye. Not worried about the pupil of the eye yet. I'm just trying to capture like the volume of the whole eye, how the eyelids wrap around the eyeball. Just like we did with the fabric down below. I want to think about that underlying volume first and then get more specific as we get to the top, but kind of building this from the inside out. And even on this larger paper, I can't really expect to get too crazy specific in here. So what I'm after is just the volume and the planes of the whole eye and just really what the light is doing, how it's affecting it. If I only paint this shadow on this eye socket here without including the one on the forehead, it's going to look like he has a bruised eye. If I only paint the shadow on the forehead without including the one down here, this is going to look like his head is dented. So we kind of have to like look at the whole big picture, include all of the shadows for the light to make sense and hold up. The light has to be consistent because that's just how we're going to understand what we're seeing. It's all about how the shadows fall. Just nuancing a little bit of like in and out within the shadow shape here, the varying degrees of light and dark.
What size brush are you using? A 6 or an 8?
This is 6 or a 9, but I think it's a 6. It's a 6.
The 6.
Yeah, this is the smallest one I have. See, there's this little bit of light right there as the side plane of the nose runs down towards the cheekbone. Pull it out a little bit and rebuild it a little bit. But okay, so I'm basically repeating the same process over and over here. I go in and just get a little bit more specific each time. I'm pushing the colors a little more each time, and then I let it dry and then come back and do it again. We haven't gotten to do too much of this semester because we're always moving so quickly. So it's nice to be able to push these further. I wish that glare would go away and you could see this how I'm seeing it. If I tilt it, I don't know. To get rid of the masking fluid. Now that it's served its purpose, I don't want these to be too clear-cut graphic shapes, so I'll go in and soften those a little bit. A little bit on this eye. I'm kind of afraid to rub that away just because everything's wet right there. Let me try. No, this is a bad idea. I should stop. This is all still wet. I'm gonna wait a minute. A little bit right here too. Still plenty I could push here on the light side of the face. Even though it's really bright right here, the highlight is like it's confusing because he does have really light hair right on the edge there, but the highlight is not necessarily on the very edge of the form because the form goes back in space a little bit. So there's a little bit more of that saturated mid-tone out here on the edges. I could also plug in some of that here. A little bit less saturated in the facial hair. And a little bit lighter. Almost kind of like got a little bit of green in it. So I'm gonna add some blue, some yellow ochre. Almost time for me to wrap it up here. A little bit early today. Push the pupil of the eye here a little bit. Oh, I forgot to take out that masking fluid. That's what I was gonna do next. Okay, well, just ignore this. I still wish I had more time on this portrait, as much time as we took on this. It's a couple weeks in a row. I appreciate everyone's patience, but even still, I've got plenty to go for here. I'm still not committing too darkly or too sharply to any of those details. So as tempting as it might be to outline the eyeballs with something really dark, we want to sneak up on that slowly. Draw and paint from the inside out, building up those general forms that are less obvious first.
Shane?
Mm-hmm.
I got closer to the color that I was looking for by combining neutral tint and Da Vinci plain orange. So I got that kind of, I don't know, reddish brown, orangey brown
Huh.
by combining those two.
What is neutral tint? What does that look like?
It's probably like the Payne's gray.
Okay, cool.
And I like to combine it with a lot of different colors to get that, rather than just black or, really dark. Green goes good in blues. They all kind of combine to give a nice hue that's a little bit off, your normal dark, like for the shaded area, like what you're doing now there.
Yeah.
I use that in the background. I used a green plus the neutral tint.
Cool.
Image. I was just going to show you this thing. See the color test down here at the bottom? So that
Oh,
was
yeah.
with
Cool.
neutral tint and the orange, Da Vinci orange.
Nice.
So I put some of that up into the garment up here.
Yeah.
Still a little too red, but I'm on, I'm getting closer and all that. So
Yeah, it's like a
that's what
cooler, darker, less saturated red, a little bit
yeah.
earthy.
And
That's
I
great.
pulled up some of the light over here. So do you want us to post these then, and then you'll kind
I would,
of just wrap it up?
yeah, I would like you to post them, even though technically the class ends today. I will check in on Canvas and keep an eye out. I want to just see if you work on anything further. I'd love to see it. You're not required to. And, if you already worked on your personal project, final painting today, if you want feedback on anything, please post it and I'd love to just take a look and see where everyone ends up. I'm going to stop the recording here.